Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Why are we having all these people from shithole countries come here? That, according to the Washington Post, is what Donald Trump today uttered during a meeting aimed at finding a cross-party deal on immigration. The revelation comes hot on the heels of Michael Wolff's book on the Trump White House. A bit like any tweet by the president, fire and furies caused a stir, the ramifications of which may not truly be understood for some time to come. What we do know is that a bad-tempered tiff between the president and his former White House advisor Steve Bannon over the contents of Wolff's book has changed the dynamics of the US political climate with his departure this week from Breitbart News. Well, Michael Wolff is with us now for his very first British TV interview, joins us from New York. Great to have you, Michael. Did you feel when you were writing this book, when you were putting this book together, did you feel as if you were trying to bring down the president?
Quite the opposite. I went into this project, into the White House, with an entirely open mind. I really would have been willing to write a book about the unexpected success of Donald Trump. That, of course, is not what I found. Quite the opposite. What I found was a White House filled with the people closest to him who turned out to be the people most worried about him.
And when you talk about going into the White House, it's the details that are fascinating for many of us. Give us a sense of your access. Donald Trump, of course, denies that he spoke to you, denies that you had any access. Did you have a hard pass? Did you walk into the same place every time? Did you say hello to the same people?
No. Well, actually, yes. Yes, I mean, exactly. I mean, it's amusing that Donald Trump says that I had no access and no permission because I was there for the better part of 7 months. So one has to ask the question, how, in fact, did I get there? And the answer is actually Donald Trump. I said to Donald Trump, and he says that he doesn't know me, but in fact, we've known each other for 20 years. At any rate, I said to him, I would like to come to be an observer at the White House. And he thought I was asking for a job. I said, no. What I want to do is write a book. And his face kind of fell as with absolute lack of interest in the idea of a book.
So,
but he sort of said, okay, yeah, sure, knock yourself out. And with that, using that basically became the carte blanche for me to enter the White House, to stay there, to chat, sit down with almost every member of the senior staff again and again and again and again.
And with Trump himself, how many times would you say you conversed with Trump personally since he became president?
I have said from the beginning on this that I have spent about 3 hours with Donald Trump through the campaign, the transition, and in the White House.
But since he became president, how long would that have been?
From the inauguration on, there was, we had one on-the-record session, and then I would see him in the West Wing, and we would chat.
You didn't presumably see Bannon quitting Breitbart News as a direct consequence of this book, did you?
I didn't anticipate that. I mean, it seems to have been the outcome.
So, my
yes,
question
please.
is, do you think then that Bannon remains a key figure on the ideological right? Will Trump be weakened or strengthened without Bannon now? Is he going to lose his base? Is he going to go softer, or does it make the whole next year of elections easier for him?
You know, I don't think we know the answer to this. It may well mean that Trump goes to the traditional Republican side, does not run these the sort of the wingnut party in congressional races, and it gives the Republicans an advantage. That's one scenario. Another scenario is that Steve Bannon decides to take down Donald Trump.
And can he do that? Without Breitbart, without a base?
I think, I don't know. I mean, Steve Bannon is, his title in the White House was chief strategist, and Steve is nothing if not the ultimate strategist. So I would anticipate that at this point he is thinking through his options.
Okay.
But I felt when he spoke to me for this book that he was making on his way to making a calculated break with the president, who honestly he seemed to regard as an idiot.
I want to pick up on some of the critiques of the book. For example, that you let conflicting narratives get told, unclear whether you've been told these things firsthand, whether you've had conversations, whether they're direct quotes. Some have said it's directly out of Trump's own playbook. Why didn't you make it more rigorous? Did you ever feel
let me talk a little about this book. The book has become something more than a book. It has become a political event. So that means it's going to be the subject of an enormous amount of controversy. It means that a lot of people said things to me and now they find themselves as deers in the headlight. My job on this book, and I really had one goal, it was to, as I sat there day after day on a couch in the West Wing, is to bring the reader right there, so that the reader could experience what I experienced.
So you don't regret
my job
the fact
was not
that
to
it's
take
so
down
unfiltered?
the president. No, that's my job, is to bring an absolutely unfiltered account. There has been an enormous amount of controversy about that, but what I would say is that there's room for a lot of interpretations of this White House. Not only is there room, but there will be. So it is not just, there are the daily reporters who are doing a good job of covering the White House. But my account, and it's an account that has obviously resonated with people apparently everywhere, is a contextual story of what has happened over these number of months.
Michael, let me ask you.
I am giving the forest for the trees.
Sure. And at this point, you have written the book after he became president. Many journalists now are questioning how they covered the campaign. Is there a guilt that you or your colleagues were too caught up in a very sensational, sexy, fun story to cover? Do you think if you were going back over the campaign now, you would be covering Trump in a very different way?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure I have any colleagues, which is part of the interesting thing here that allowed me to write in a totally independent version of this White House. But I think from the beginning there has been a problem. No one has known how to cover Donald Trump. When this administration began, many in the media said we can't normalize this person. Well, effectively, the media coverage has normalized it. So the explosions every day have become so normal that we can no longer remember what happened the day before. I would maintain that I actually may have found a way to write about this presidency and this president.
Okay. Michael Wolff, great to have you on the show. Thank you very much indeed.
So more now on our top story, Donald Trump having to deny a foul-mouthed outburst on immigration. Joining us from New York via Skype is John LeBoutillier, a former Republican congressman and co-host of Political Insiders on Fox News. And also in New York is Harlan Hill, the founder of Democrats for Trump. Mr. Boutillier, first of all, are you shaking your head as much as we are, having to use the word shithole on the afternoon news this afternoon?
Well, first of all, I'm amazed it's being used anywhere. This is how he has debased our society, obviously debased the presidency. And I can just imagine what Republicans would say if a Democratic president did the exact same thing. The hypocrisy among my fellow Republicans knows no bounds. They never criticize this guy, or if they do, they then move on from it, never hold him accountable for the horrible things he says and does. And eventually, they will be punished at the ballot box. They're going to get wiped out in November because of this type of behavior.
Mr. Hill, you're from what sounds like a rather strange hybrid group, Democrats for Trump. What side of the argument are you coming down on? Are you prepared to defend the president and his apparently foul mouth?
Look, the president is who he is. He's not going to change. This is the man that was elected on November the 8th, 2016. I don't think anybody should be shocked by how frank he speaks. He's unfiltered. That's what many Americans like, frankly. And so I think with his base, this is exactly what they want to hear. Because there's a ring of truth to it. I mean, the president is frustrated because he's trying to do a deal with congressional Democrats and they're throwing up roadblocks. And the president is wholly uninterested in providing an immigration priority to people that come from countries with zero education, who don't speak English, et cetera, people that are not prepared to contribute to the American economy in areas that we need. The American immigration policy needs to be one where the most valued American citizens come first, the existing American citizens come first, which means that we're not flooding the country with more unskilled labor. That's what the president's talking about here.
Sorry to interrupt. You're happy for the president to use a term like shithole to describe Haiti and countries across the entire continent of Africa. That's okay for you. There's a grain of truth there. Is that what you're saying?
Well, look, the president was speaking behind closed doors. He spoke frankly. You know, the basis of this is one that we need an immigration policy that puts American citizens first. And the president was speaking frankly behind closed doors, and that leaked out. I don't think that he would have used this language publicly. You know, but if every president was held accountable for everything that they said behind closed doors, you'd have this exact same outrage about Barack Obama, President George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, et cetera. Look, I can't hold him. I can't bash him because someone's leaked this out. It's totally unsubstantiated. We don't even have video to prove that it's true. The president denies that it even happened. I don't know. We weren't there. We weren't in the room. We don't have proof that he actually said this. If he did, there's a ring of truth to some of this, and our immigration policy needs to change.
So, Mr. Boutlier, the president's the president. You know, get used to it, seems to be the message from the Democrat on the other side of the argument that you're sitting on.
Well, first of all, this guy Harlan Hill, head of Democrats for Trump, when they have a meeting, they could hold it in a telephone booth. There are no Democrats for Trump. That's a joke. He's a joke.
That's not true.
Says that. Well, I didn't interrupt you.
First of all, I am a former Democrat. Well, no, I'm going to defend myself. I'm a former Democrat, but it's worth noting that over 8 million Obama voters crossed over to support President Trump in 2016. So just empirically, you're not on the facts are not on your side.
Let me get it straight. The group is now.
You can continue
Okay, Mr. Hill, should we let Mr. Boutlier just get a response to your response?
Personally, he attacked me personally. It's totally uncalled for.
One at a time. Mr. Boutlier, what have you got to say about Mr. Hill?
Well, we just learned from Mr. Hill that his group needs to be called former Democrats for Trump because he's not even a Democrat. So to have a group called Democrats for Trump, this guy is a pro-Trump lackey. It's a joke. I mean, come on. And to blame the immigration problem, the fact they can't get something through a Republican-controlled House and Senate, has nothing to do with the Democrats. It's the Republicans can't agree with each other on this position.
OK, if we could just park that there, move on from the foul-mouthed comments. There's another controversy, of course, about Donald Trump saying he's not coming to London to open the US Embassy because it was Barack Obama's idea, even though it was George Bush's. Mr. Hill, was he right to say that, even though that tweet seems to be full of inaccuracies?
Well, I mean, look, it is true that the American embassy in London is wildly expensive. I'm not sure that it made fiscal sense to invest in it. You know, I think that the existing American embassy in Grosvenor Square was perfectly adequate. Perhaps there were security concerns that led for us to relocate the embassy. But regardless, it was far, far, far too expensive. And so I can identify with the president's hesitancy to go to London and celebrate it. It's a temple to, you know, bureaucratic excess.
And both of you, first of all,
of course, that has nothing to do with why he canceled the trip. The real story is England didn't want him. He was going to have massive demonstrations against him. He likes to be feted and treated like royalty, and he wasn't going to be. And he pulled the plug and came up with another BS excuse. And by the way, here I am a Republican, and I'm saying this about this guy. It's an incredible spectacle to watch the inversion of the Republican Party into what it has become. And it's why he's at 36% in the middle of a good economy, a happy country economically, where 63% of the people say the economy is good or excellent, but they only rate him at 36%. That tells you what his
and he's going to win.
behavior,
He's going to win overwhelmingly in 2020.
Toxic personality has done. Well, you don't have a clue about 2020. Let's get through 2018 first.
Mr. Hill, your prediction for 2018, the midterm elections.
I'm sorry?
Your prediction for the midterm elections at the end of the year, is this going to help him, or is he losing support in the areas he needs it?
Well, based on historical trends, polling, and data, Hillary Clinton should have won in 2016. There's no doubt about that. And everyone betted against President Trump, and he proved them wrong. I think that we may be seeing a duplicate effort here. I mean, Democrats are really hyper-focused on President Trump, the man. They're trying to make this election a referendum on that. I am not a believer that people actually turn out to elections to vote against people. I think that they turn out to elections to vote for something. And that was evidenced by 2016 overwhelmingly. So if this is going to be, if the midterms are going to be a referendum on President Donald Trump, and that's all the Democrats have to hang their hat on, in an economy that is booming, where we've had just dramatic, unprecedented 3% growth for 2 quarters in a row here, the stock market keeps setting all-time highs. We've hit over 70 all-time highs in just the last year under President Trump's leadership. If the Democrats aren't going to come up with a cohesive message to counter the president, then I think that it's not beyond the realm of possibility that we could have a surprise in 2018. But I'll still say that the evidence is on the side of the Democrats. They should have a wave here. But, you know, we've seen this before. And are they going to drop the ball? I think that it's possible.
Mr. Boutlier, what's your prediction for the end of the year, and what impact this is all having on Trump's support and your party support in the 2018 crucial elections?
Well, first of all, I don't agree with Harlan. Unfortunately, people vote against much more than they vote for. And that is why a year and 3 months later, Trump still throws out Hillary Clinton in virtually every statement and every tweet, because against her, he looks better. And he knows that. He's got to have her as his foil. Even with the prime minister. I didn't interrupt you, Harlan. You need to learn some manners, okay? And I'm not going to put up with it. Okay, that's it. Dominic, I'm not going to be on with the guy who's so rude that he interrupts. I'm done.
Probably a good time to end that there as we talk about manners, the president's lack of them, and the inversion of the American political scene that has a Republican speaking against the president and apparently a Democrat speaking in favour of him. Good afternoon. Donald Trump is embroiled in 2 major rows spanning the Atlantic. First, he's had to deny claims he called several countries shitholes in a conversation about immigration. Secondly, he's announced he's not coming to the UK to open the new US Embassy building. His first remarks prompted this rebuke from a UN spokesman.
These are shocking and shameful comments from the President of the United States. I'm sorry, but there's no other word one can use but racist. You cannot dismiss entire countries and continents as shitholes, whose entire populations, who are not white, are therefore not welcome.
Well, live now to Washington and our US correspondent Mark Austin to try and make sense of all this. Mark, now Donald Trump is saying he didn't use that word. On the other side, Democrats are saying he did. Who's America going to believe?
Well, I suppose in a way you are dealing with a credible media and an incredible president. It's very awkward, this, for Donald Trump. And, you know, barely a day passes now when he doesn't say something that upsets someone somewhere. This is another example of that. Outrage here, outrage around the world. And then this morning, Donald Trump tweets his explanations and denials. 2 tweets denying this. The first one, he said, the language used by me at the DACA meeting, which is the immigration meeting, was tough, but this wasn't the language used. What was really tough was the outlandish proposal made, a big setback, referring to a Democrat proposal on immigration. And then an even stronger denial on Twitter. He said, never said anything derogatory about Haitians, other than Haiti is obviously a very poor and troubled country. Never said take them out, made up by Dems. I have a wonderful relationship with Haitians, probably should record future meetings, he said. Unfortunately, no trust. Now, those 2 tweets were quite a big call by Donald Trump. This was a closed-door meeting, but there were other congressmen in there, mainly Republicans, but also a Democrat Senator, Dick Durbin. And Dick Durbin has this morning confirmed that Donald Trump did use
the word shithole, and this is what Dick Durbin had to say.
He said, Haitians, do we need more Haitians? And then he went on when we started to describe the immigration from Africa that was being protected in this bipartisan measure. That's when he used these vile and vulgar comments, calling the nations they come from shitholes. The exact word used by the president, not just once, but repeatedly.
So, Mark, while you're speaking there, it's not just Dick Durbin who doesn't like what Donald Trump's been saying. The US ambassador to Panama, it's just broken on the Wires news agency, has resigned on principle, telling the State Department he can no longer serve the Trump administration in a resignation letter read to Reuters. So that's the US ambassador to Panama resigning over what his boss, Donald Trump, has said. I mean, that's an extraordinary development, but I guess not that extraordinary in the context of a president who hasn't appointed a lot of ambassadors and seems to have utter contempt, in a sense, for the entire diplomatic class and the State Department.
No, well, you know, it is quite extraordinary, Dominic, because what you've got here then is Donald Trump coming out this morning and denying he made these comments. He said he didn't use that language. He didn't say the things he's been accused of. I've just read you out the tweets. And yet, one of his own officials, one of the people he's appointed, presumably, or at least let stay in post, one of his own people in quite a senior position does not believe him. And so that's where we are. That's where we are.
Yeah, an extraordinary development. But also in the light of the fact that this president is also not going to come to London to open the US embassy here, I guess also showing his contempt for the diplomatic class in America, for the State Department. Is there there's a clear sense of a lack of morale amongst diplomats in America? If this carries on, is there a danger that they could start deserting in even greater numbers than they have been already?
Well, there's already been a huge cutback at the State Department. Rex Tillerson was, in effect, brought in to oversee the cutback, something like 30%, I think, and lots of key positions have gone. You know, there's an extraordinary situation with the whole Korea debate as well, that you would have thought that with North Korea being probably the burning foreign policy issue of the time, that he would appoint an assistant secretary in Seoul, in South Korea. Now, an assistant secretary doesn't sound that important, but is actually very important. Assistant secretaries, certainly in Asia, are the people who get things done, are the people who get stuck into the negotiations. There is no assistant secretary appointed for Seoul. So, you know, there are lots of positions, lots of positions in the Middle East that have not been filled yet, a year into this administration. So it is a growing problem. And just one last point, Dominic, on this whole immigration issue. His critics are saying today that it actually opens a window into how Donald Trump actually views the immigration debate, that maybe it's not about, you know, key skills, let's have a skill-based system for entry. Maybe it is about the kind of people that you want to be surrounded by. Maybe it is about race. That's the sort of thing that's being discussed here today. But for Donald Trump, you've got to remember he does these things with a purpose, and there will be a key part of his support who will find this understandable. They will speak in the same kind of language that Donald Trump speaks in, and it will resonate with them. So there is a purpose behind this. I think you've always got to remember that. You know, Donald Trump's a pretty shrewd political operator in many ways, but you know, the fallout is that it outrages people here in America and around the world.
Mark Austin in Washington, thank you very much. So, quick recap on that development on this story. The US ambassador to Panama resigned on principle, telling the State Department he can no longer serve the Trump administration. The State Department now has just reacted to that, slightly contradicting its own outgoing ambassador to Panama, saying that it can confirm the departure of the US ambassador to Panama, but saying he decided to retire for personal reasons as of March the 9th this year. So they're saying for personal reasons, and early reports from the ambassador himself, it seems, saying he was retiring or resigning at least on principle. So moving on now to the second controversy surrounding Donald Trump. He has caused more controversy by announcing he's not coming to the UK to open the new US embassy building in London. Mr. Trump tweeted, "The reason I cancelled my trip to London is that I am not a big fan of the Obama administration having sold perhaps the best located and finest embassy in London for peanuts, only to build a new one in an off location for $1.2 billion. Bad deal. Wanted me to cut ribbon? No!" Exclamation mark.
The reality's got nothing to do with the embassy, of course. I think it's because this White House insists on there not being any hostile demonstrations against Donald Trump when he travels abroad. Now, you go to China or Saudi Arabia or something like that, it's not that difficult. But nobody can guarantee that there would be no hostile demonstrations. And my hunch is that a combination of the White House preference in terms of the optics and probably a bit of Secret Service said to the president, or the decision was taken one way or another not to go ahead. I don't see this as a snub.
Well, we can speak to our chief political correspondent, John Craig, at the new US Embassy in central London. John, any sign yet of how people there, as they go to work in their new building, feel about the fact that their president won't be coming to officially open it? And any sign of regret from Downing Street that the invitation to Donald Trump that was extended by Theresa May at the beginning of his administration now seems to be being thrown back across the Atlantic, certainly in terms of coming here to open the embassy at least?
Well, according to Number 10, of course, the invitation to Mr. Trump still stands. Now, you'll remember it was only a week after the president took office that Theresa May went there, and there were those famous or infamous pictures of the pair of them holding hands. That's when the invitation came. But, of course, there's been an almighty row. The Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, said he wasn't welcome in Parliament, so no address to Parliament. Also, there was the threat of demonstrations. In one phone call between the President and the Prime Minister, that was back in May, the President said he didn't want to come until he felt more welcome. He was obviously concerned about demonstrations. And Jeremy Corbyn last year was talking about how he would support demonstrations against Mr. Trump. Then, of course, there have been the diplomatic rows. First of all, there's the biggest row probably was over Mr. Trump retweeting tweets from a right-wing organisation, Britain First, back in November. Then there was the dispute about the moving of the US embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which the British government didn't support either. And so the visit was never going to be a big state occasion with a speech in Parliament and all that. It was always going to be very low-key. And clearly the President has decided it's not worth it. But of course, there has been a welcome from his opponents, those who've clashed with him, like Sadiq Khan. Now, Mr. Khan, of course, has attacked Mr. Trump for his policies on Muslims, and also they had a spat over the President's criticism of the way he'd handled the terror attacks in London. So Sadiq Khan has said this today. Many Londoners have made it clear that Donald Trump is not welcome here. While he's pursuing such a divisive agenda, it seems he's finally got that message. Well, that prompted a response from Boris Johnson, the former mayor of London, now the Foreign Secretary, who said this: the US is the biggest single investor in the UK, yet Khan and Corbyn seem determined to put this crucial relationship at risk. We'll not allow US-UK relations to be endangered by some puffed-up, pompous popinjay in City Hall. Well, I imagine that probably made Sadiq Khan and his allies in City Hall probably have a good laugh, given that criticism came from Boris Johnson. As for whether Mr. Johnson was speaking for the government, well, Number 10 seemed a bit confused about that. They did a bit later on say that yes, he was. The Number 10 source said he spoke for the government. Boris expresses himself in his own inimitable way, but we agree that any risk to the crucial US-UK relationship is not in the country's best interest. Well, at the official Number 10 briefing, the Prime Minister's spokesman did say that the relationship had not been damaged. So it does seem as though there is some embarrassment, a rather over-the-top reaction from Boris Johnson, not for the first time.
John Craig outside the new US Embassy in London. Thank you very much. From Lichfield, I'm joined now by Conservative MP Michael Fabricant, who has supported Donald Trump in the past. Do you support him in both of these controversies, Mr. Fabricant, today?
Well, I don't support anyone who refers to a whole nation or a whole group of nations as being I won't say the word, but that's a broad generalization. But I do support the fact that he's head of state of the United States, he's head of government of the United States, and the United States is a major and important ally of the UK. We're the biggest single investors in the United States, and they're the biggest single investors in us. And, you know, there's a lot of hypocrisy. I mean, you've got Jeremy Corbyn and the Mayor of London both saying they would encourage demonstrations against the visit from Donald Trump, and yet they didn't say that when President Xi of China came. They support other despots around the world, like the President of Venezuela. So, you know, there's a lack of consistency there, actually.
Well, it might be an important relationship, but he doesn't want to come here anymore. So that seems to be now done and dusted.
Well, I think this visit is done and dusted, but I have no doubt that Her Majesty the Queen, the head of state of the United Kingdom, will eventually invite President Trump to visit the United Kingdom, and I'm sure he'll accept. And I hope there won't be mass demonstrations, because they achieve very little.
Well, your hopes aside, there almost certainly will be mass demonstrations. As you say, you have a number of politicians encouraging them, and he's enormously unpopular, isn't he, in the UK? What impact will that have on the special relationship if he comes here and, as is almost certain, there are huge demonstrations against him?
Well, the United Kingdom is always obsessed with the special relationship, and will the special relationship last? Will it be damaged? And so on and so forth. Actually, the special relationship is something just taken as a given in the United States of America. You know, the London embassy is the most important embassy to the US diplomatic service around the world. The United Kingdom is the most important ally of the United States. We share a common heritage. We have the same legal system. Many Brits work in the US. Many Americans work in London and the rest of the UK. And the linkage there is going to last. And of course, it's in the United Kingdom's interest that it lasts as well, because we both benefit by our mutual friendship.
Just a few days after he moved into the White House, Theresa May was over the Atlantic going to Philadelphia to make what critics said was a rather ingratiating speech to Republicans there. Then she went to the White House where her hand was held by the president. She extended this invitation for a state visit to the UK. In return, it seems, for positive noises about a Brexit trade deal. In reflection, was that all rather desperate, do you think? Was it premature? Was it a tactical error by the Prime Minister, do you think?
No, I think he was very, very sensible. As I say, the United States is a very important ally economically of the United Kingdom. It's in the United Kingdom's interest to get on with the US. Look, I, as a Conservative MP, was no great fan of Tony Blair or Gordon Brown. But look, it didn't stop me from being pro-British. And similarly, you know, there are many people in the UK and indeed in the US who think that Trump is not the president that they would have liked. But you know, it goes beyond that. We're not inviting him as head of government. We're inviting him as head of state, if the Queen does that. And by the way, the Prime Minister was in no position to actually invite him on a state visit. Only the head of state can do that, namely the Queen. But it was absolutely the right thing to do. You know, we don't want to see unemployment. We've got very low employment in the UK, unemployment rather, and one of the reasons is because of our trade relationship with the United States and other countries.
I'll have to stop you there. Thank you very much. We'll wait to see if that state visit ever actually happens. But moving on now. Donald Trump has now arrived in the Roosevelt Room and
many distinguished guests for joining us here today. It's a great honor. Earlier this week, I had the tremendous privilege to join Isaac and Alveda to sign into law legislation redesignating the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site to the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Park. The new law expands the area protected and historic sites for the future. Generations of Americans are becoming so important, and this is a great honor for us and a great honor to Dr. King. Today we gather in the White House to honor the memory of a great American hero, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. On January 15th, 1929, Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia. He would go on to change the course of human history As a young man, Dr. King decided to follow the calling of his father and grandfather to become a Christian pastor. He would later write that it was quite easy for me to think of a God of love, mainly because I grew up in a family where love was central. That is what Reverend King preached all of his life: love. Love for each other, for neighbors, and for our fellow Americans. Dr. King's faith and his love for humanity led him and so many other heroes to courageously stand up for civil rights of African Americans. Through his bravery and sacrifice, Dr. King opened the eyes and lifted the conscience of our nation. He stirred the hearts of our people to recognize the dignity written in every human soul. Today we celebrate Dr. King for standing up for the self-evident truth Americans hold so dear, that no matter what the color of our skin or the place of our birth, we are all created equal by God. This April, we will mark a half-century since Reverend King was so cruelly taken from us by an assassin's bullet. But while Dr. King is no longer with us, his words and his vision only grow stronger through time. Today we mourn his loss, we celebrate his legacy, and we pledge to fight for his dream of equality, freedom, justice, and peace. I will now sign the proclamation making January 15th, 2018, the Martin Luther King Jr. federal holiday, and encourage all Americans to observe this day with acts of civic work and community service in honor of Dr. King's extraordinary life, and it was extraordinary indeed, and his great legacy. Thank you. God bless you all, and God bless America. And with that, I'd like to ask a great friend of mine, Secretary Carson, for remarks. Then we're going to be signing the very important proclamation. Thank you very much. Ben?
Thank you, Mr. President. It's an honor to be here today, celebrating this solemn occasion. And I thank you for signing legislation to designate the birthplace, church, and tomb of Dr. Martin Luther King as a National Historic Park. His monumental struggle for civil rights earned these places in his life, faith, and death the same honor as Mount
Well, we'll leave Ben
Vernon
Carson there, the
famous
Trump administration
humble log cabin
housing
in
secretary, who has come off the back of Donald Trump, the president, who was talking about Martin Luther King before he signs something to do with Martin Luther King. And in that speech, he referred to the doctor's dream of equality, freedom, justice, and peace. And he's reported today of having referred to developing nations, Haiti, and others across Africa in very different language. So a ceremony where he was celebrating an American known for his extraordinary use of the English language, a president who is now being accused of misusing that language, certainly in terms that you wouldn't normally associate with a leader of the free world. So to discuss that, and I think it's fair to say the increasing prevalence of foul or unusual language in public discourse, perhaps, I'm joined by consultant linguist at King's College London, Tony Thorne. Tony, it's probably not what you went into linguistics expecting to discuss on live television, but what do you make of the president using a term, we have to use it, the term shithole, to describe Haiti and African countries? Is there a growing acceptance of that language, or do you think it still has a power to shock when people hear that coming out of a politician's mouth?
Linguists are not upset. Maybe understandably, we take a scientific objective view of language by language itself. But we feel that language is entirely context specific. It's all about the intention of this, not the word itself, because the same phrase that Donald Trump used, if it's used on a camping holiday by young males who've been drinking, it's entirely appropriate and would be expected. It's all about where you use it, what your intentions are. But I think Trump, if he used it, he's tried to deny it today, but it's been reconfirmed by people who were at that Oval Office meeting. Trump using it in that place with those people, about Haitians who, have a very troubled relationship historically with the US, is shocking. It's shocking on several levels. It seems to be disrespecting the people he had in front of him, the senatorial committee he was talking to. And of course, it deeply disrespects the inhabitants of Haiti and sub-Saharan Africa. So in that context, that kind of crude, vulgar language, I think is shocking for many people.
To play his supporters' advocate, though, he would say, and his supporters would say, his main selling point and something that propelled him to the White House is his authenticity. And he's using language that many of his supporters may use on a day-to-day basis, and therefore he's being a lot more honest than other politicians might be in Washington, politicians who have been rejected by millions of Americans in the recent US election.
Yeah, his aides and supporters have already come forward to defend him by saying that essentially what he said was true. Now, I find that in itself a little bit shocking, that if you translate this phrase he used, which has already gone so viral, it's now being referred to as SHC by its initials, the way he designated these countries. I think it's again, they're trying to say that he was just speaking the truth. And this has often been used by populist politicians to say that they are voicing what ordinary people think. And I'm sure many of his followers, many of his opponents speak like that in their private life, in the bar room. But it's still the appropriacy of it, and what's behind it. What does this betray about his feelings about the populations of those countries? It doesn't. The vulgarity and strength of that particular phrase, to me, doesn't just suggest that he's talking about. It doesn't mean economically troubled. It's a much stronger slur than that, I would think.
However, it does seem to be increasingly prevalent, the use of previously unacceptable terms in public discourse. We had an even more shocking expletive used in the House of Lords last week. Are we getting more used to it? Are we more tolerant of this kind of language publicly?
First of all, there are differences. I mean, globally, even among English speakers, the British, and this is not just my opinion. This is based on research and surveys. British in general are much more tolerant of so-called bad language, toilet talk, swearing, than in the United States. Certainly in public. Baroness Jenkins used the C word for the very first time in the House of Lords yesterday, and she was quoting some very insulting messages or slurs that she personally received. And I think while this was shocking, again, the context, she was trying to show people how vile and virulent the kind of online and verbal abuse is that politicians have to suffer, that it maybe is admissible, even though it's the first time it's ever been used. The C word itself in the UK can be used, depending on who uses it where, humorously, in a friendly way. It's not necessarily always a shocking word, but it's still our worst taboo. All the other words, all the other bad words are pretty commonly bandied about in the UK. Even several of the B words were used in Parliament in the last week or so. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say them, but B words anyway.
We'll stop you before you do. I think we've had enough foul language on Sky News today, Mr. Thorne, but thank you for your time and your linguistic analysis.
President Trump's visit to Britain next month is off. He had been due to attend the official opening of the new US Embassy in South London, but he tweeted he was not a big fan of the embassy and blamed Barack Obama's administration for a bad deal. Downing Street says an invitation for a state visit will still take place, though no date has been set. Meanwhile, comments allegedly made by Mr. Trump about some African countries have led to accusations that he's racist. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landale has more.
The new US Embassy, more than $1 billion of prime fortified American real estate on the south bank of the River Thames in London. A monument, we're told, to America's commitment to Britain that the US ambassador had hoped would be formally opened by Donald Trump next month.
Yes, I do hope it, and we're going to welcome him when he comes.
Except that he's not coming. Mr. Trump said that he'd cancelled the trip because he opposed the sale by President Obama of what he called perhaps the best located and finest embassy in London for peanuts, only to build a new one in an off location for $1.2 billion. Bad deal. Wanted me to cut ribbon? No. A decision that was welcomed by his critics.
Here you have the head of state of another country who's not only promoted hatred and division in his own country, but is surely, given his online activity, guilty of doing the same in our country too.
Actually, the decision to sell the old embassy here in Mayfair was initially taken by President Bush in an attempt to find a more secure location.
Grosvenor Square, police warned to expect trouble waited.
The old embassy had also been the scene of many demonstrations in the past, and diplomats said it was the threat of similar protests that had spooked the White House.
No Trump out!
The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, said there would be mass protests like these, but peaceful ones. The Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, accused Mr Khan of putting UK-US relations at risk, a view that Downing Street didn't echo, but others did.
In this country, we have the Mayor of London, Jeremy Corbyn and many others, encouraging large-scale street protests against him. And I do think that must be part of his calculation.
And that's the point. In his first year of office, Mr Trump has travelled the world, visiting most other G7 countries and several European nations, including France, Germany and Belgium. The UK is notable for its absence. The US ambassador has said that this fortress of glass represents a new era in friendship between the US and the UK, a strengthening of the relationship. The fear among diplomats is that the president's decision not to open this building signals that, actually for him at least, Britain is not a priority. So for now, the closest we'll get to seeing Mr Trump at the new embassy is this waxwork. As ministers say, they look forward to a visit at some point in the future.
Well, it's for the US president to determine his travel priorities. Obviously, it's an important diplomatic partner for the UK. We want the closest possible relationship with the US.
Tonight, as Mr Trump honoured the civil rights leader Martin Luther King, he was caught up in yet another row, having to deny making racist remarks about African countries. Home or abroad, this president is rarely free from controversy.
Mr President, are you a racist?
James Landale, BBC News.
Well, Nick Bryant is at the White House for us this evening. Nick, let's just talk about those comments that James was referring to at the end of his piece. What is a president alleged to have said?
At a meeting in the Oval Office yesterday with Republican and Democratic lawmakers about immigration, he is alleged to have used a slur directed against Haiti, El Salvador and African nations. Now, Donald Trump denies using that particular term. I'm not going to repeat it on air, although he does say he used strong language. But a senior Democratic senator in the room not only said that he used that word, that he used it repeatedly. And what we've just seen there, Fiona, is worth reflecting on, because to my mind it is unprecedented. A sitting president in the West Wing of the White House being asked by reporters, are you a racist? And that unfortunate and contradictory setting where he was signing a proclamation in honour of the great civil rights leader Martin Luther King.
And there's been quite a reaction to it, not just from the journalists there, but from the UN, for example.
There's been a barrage of international criticism. A UN official has said that comment, that alleged comment, was racist. You have had African countries like Botswana condemning it and even contacting the Trump administration saying, does that term apply to us? But the White House, in the aftermath of the first reports of this alleged slur, came out last night with a statement which didn't deny that the president had said it. Indeed, it almost seemed to double down. And some administration officials were telling reporters that the president believed that this would play well with his base and that he was taking a victory lap in the West Wing. But it's another example of where this America First rhetoric often means that America is alone.
Nick Bryant at the White House, thank you.
Hate-filled, vile and racist. That's how President Trump's comments on immigration have been described by a leading Democratic senator who heard him refer to Haiti, El Salvador and African countries as shitholes. It's not just Democrats either. The House Speaker, Paul Ryan, among members of his own party, describing the remarks as very unfortunate, unhelpful. From President Trump himself, a kind of denial, as he tweeted, "This was not the language used." Porrick O'Brien joins us now from Washington. Porrick.
Krish, the challenge when it comes to reporting on President Trump's latest vile outburst is to try to meaningfully analyse what it means for American politics and what it means for American families. And even when you're talking to his support base, as we've been doing over the last week, what you hear again and again is that if he does or says something that hurts me and my family, that's enough. So when it comes to hurting those families, every time he tweets out something or says something like he does, another family gets hurt. And today it was the turn of Haitians and Africans. Tomorrow it'll probably be the turn for somebody else. So here is the key question that the Republican Party has to ask itself. When it comes to these outbursts, where is their red line when it comes to Donald Trump? I should warn you, as you'd expect, there's offensive language in my report. This morning, the taxi rank at Union Station, Washington, D.C. And news coming through that during immigration talks on Capitol Hill, the president became frustrated and questioned why America should take people from, quote, shithole countries in the Caribbean and Africa. There's been important fallout politically to the comments, which we will come to. But first, some of the pain caused by what he said to rank-and-file Americans.
I'm from Ethiopia.
You're from Ethiopia. Is Ethiopia a shithole?
No, no, sir. Ethiopia is a proud country.
That's racism.
Pure and simple, for you, it's racist.
Yeah, racist.
Come on, let's go.
And now he's trying to make America, something that is purely, for people like him, bigots and whites.
Donald Trump's comments have caused real personal hurt with the Americans in the taxi rank behind me. There'll be other Americans, of course, who will just say he's saying what we're thinking. But there's a bigger political context here, and that's in the fact that these comments were leaked in the first place, because that speaks to a breakdown in bipartisanship when it comes to the new immigration bill. These comments come at a very sensitive time in terms of US immigration reform. Democratic and Republican lawmakers are trying to reach consensus on, among other things, reforms to DACA, the program whereby immigrants brought illegally to this country as children are losing temporary protections from deportation. The president tweeted today that he hadn't used that language and should, quote, record future meetings. Unfortunately, no trust, he said. On the tightrope of legislative reform around immigration, Trump's comments in the leak have cut the rope, at least for now. This Democratic senator was in the meeting, said the president was a liar.
To no surprise, the president started tweeting this morning denying that he used those words. It is not true. He said these hate-filled things, and he said them repeatedly. And then he went on, when we started to describe the immigration from Africa that was being protected in this bipartisan measure, that's when he used these vile and vulgar comments, calling the nations they come from shitholes. The exact word used by the president, not just once, but repeatedly.
The diplomatic fallout. The US ambassador to Panama has resigned, saying he can no longer work for Trump. At the UN, this was the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
I'm sorry, but there's no other word one can use but racist. You cannot dismiss entire countries and continents as shitholes, whose entire populations, who are not white, are therefore not welcome.
In the meeting, the president also allegedly took aim at Haitian immigrants. Today is the 8th anniversary of the Haitian earthquake, in which thousands and thousands lost their lives. We spoke to the Haitian ambassador to the US this morning.
It hurts. This should have been a day for us where we're actually sitting with family, sitting with friends to mourn the death of our loved ones. And yet, sadly, we're sitting here talking about regrettable comments that apparently were made by the United States president.
Back at the taxi rank, one Iranian immigrant is oblivious to the row. All he wants to talk about, how much he loves America.
Sometimes I feel like I'm chosen by God that I'm in America.
God must loves me that I'm here.
God might love him. The President of the United States, ambivalent at best.
Well, President Trump has provoked a fair bit of outrage here too after he declared he wouldn't come to London to open the new US embassy next month because it was a bad deal and in an off location. Downing Street insisted the relationship between the two countries remained strong and deep. But London Mayor Sadiq Khan, no fan of the US president, said Trump had got the message that many Londoners were staunchly opposed. And that provoked a tirade from Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, as Matt Fried reports.
Let's start with the riddle. What is this? A set for a Star Wars remake? A futuristic garden centre with a Mexican theme? A call centre without callers? The inside of a state penitentiary? The architecture hails from a distant galaxy. The moat surrounding it owes more to the Dark Ages. It is Fortress America on the Thames. The brand new US Embassy in Battersea, whose ribbon was supposed to be cut by him. Except the surly wax version is the closest we'll get to see Donald Trump on British soil for now. The flesh and blood version cancelled his trip this morning, taking offence to the new building, its location, its cost, and blaming Barack Obama for the move. For the record, the move from this cement block that was the embassy in posh Mayfair to the new honeycomb version and aspirational 9 Elms was in fact decided under George W. Bush. But that's by the by. I spoke to our former man in Washington who suspects that there's more to the cancellation of the trip than just the building.
Why is he not coming? I think it's because this White House is adamant that the president will not travel abroad unless they get assurances that there will not be any hostile demonstrations. And my guess is in this free country, not many people have been able to say to the White House, we give you our guarantee that there will not be any demos. Perhaps also, but I'm guessing here, he feels that he would be shortchanged, not got the state visit which he was offered when he first became president, and that's obviously not part of any current plan for coming here in the next few weeks or months to open the new embassy.
The state visit, the royal rollout, our greatest weapon of mass infatuation. It's been used over and over again to lubricate the special relationship. Remember Ronnie and Her Majesty, saddle by saddle? The Clintons and the Windsors, the Bushes and the Windsors. And let's face it, George W. wasn't exactly popular here.
This room is full of mirrors. Where would you like us?
And then the Obamas in 2016, the last of their 3 visits with the monarch, a royal flush. The Obamas were even allowed into the inner sanctum, a bedtime crouch down with a future monarch. It gets even better.
So you would like to watch it together?
Yes.
Let's have a look.
Hey, Prince Harry, remember when you told us to bring it at the Invictus Games?
Careful what you wish for.
Oh, really?
What the Obamas had, the Trumps also crave. Donald Trump's late mother was an ardent royalist. His wife, Melania, is. And as a TV man, Trump knows all about the optics of a royal visit.
And this story may not be over because, who's going to be invited to the royal wedding? The Obamas, I imagine, will be because they genuinely have a close personal relationship with Prince Harry.
And if Trump isn't going to get any royal treatment, what is the point of putting up with this? And now imagine the scene if and when he actually turns up. The Mayor of London weighed in with a tweet this morning, saying that Trump had finally got the message from Londoners. The Foreign Secretary fired back at the Mayor using a word that everyone under the age of 80 had to look up. Popinjay, a derivation of parrot. He doesn't like the new embassy. American diplomats don't much care for its location. But as the stars and stripes rise over 9 Elms, we may reflect that all this is about our future relationship with our closest ally, after Brexit and beyond.
Well, we're joined now from New York by the former Foreign Secretary David Miliband, now President of the humanitarian organisation for refugees, the International Rescue Committee. If Donald Trump used this language about Africa and other countries, has he become the world's bully?
I think that President Trump's comments really drag the presidency into the gutter, and his policy agenda, which involves slashing the number of refugees coming to the US, threatening this week 200,000 El Salvadorians with a return to the #1 homicide capital of the world. Together, those policies constitute the leading edge of the drive to undermine the historic 70 years, really, of commitments to people who are fleeing from persecution. And so I think that America's moral standing, as well as its political standing, is under severe strain. I mean, he's obviously pursuing the politics of what Richard Haas, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, has called the politics of abdication internationally. But what we've seen over the last year, frankly, not just the last week, is a loss of the moral standing too.
But a lot of people on his side will say, well, look, he may be offensive, but is he wrong? You know, if these countries are so great, why do the immigrants want to come to America? That's the way they view this argument.
Well, I think that he's wrong on two levels. First of all, you've seen that countries like Botswana, Kenya are putting out diplomatic statements today saying, do we count as part of the S-hole as well? So there's a substantive point that dismissing large tracts of the world in this way is not just derogatory, it's wrong. But secondly, and more insidiously, there's the suggestion that just because someone comes from a country that has severe problems, that makes them in some way suspect. And that, I think, is what's really got people's goat, because across the US, you've got people who know the price of persecution, who found a chance to make a new life for themselves, and they find themselves condemned by their country of origin. There's one other point that I think is relevant here. Remember, President Trump, on the one hand, is saying he backs the Iranian protesters. At the same time, he's saying Iranians can't come here as refugees if they're persecuted by their own government. And so you've got the left hand and the right hand of US government not really being able to talk to each other.
But do you think he is making the world a more dangerous place? Or is he, as his supporters say, just a blunt-speaking man who actually gets things done, who actually ends up with North Korea thinking about sending teams to South Korea for the Olympics and so on?
Well, I think that's a really key point, because in all the fuss about the visit to the UK, and obviously he is responsible for his own unpopularity in the UK, there's a deeper point, which is what would the British and American governments at the moment talk about? Britain, the extent of its foreign policy is to do with how it gets out of the European Union. America is pursuing the politics of abdication. And around the world, there is a genuine crisis of diplomacy. I mean, we work in conflict zones around the world, and the world is becoming more dangerous because the great conflicts, be they in Yemen or Libya or elsewhere, are not actually being addressed diplomatically. That's not only the fault of the United States and the United Kingdom, but when they withdraw, then the global system loses its anchor. And that's what I see happening at the moment in the most dangerous trouble spots around the world.
But where does this leave Britain's foreign policy? Because Boris Johnson is clearly shoulder to shoulder with Donald Trump. He's attacking the likes of the Mayor of London, your brother, who also tweeted against Donald Trump in the last few hours, and using some pretty colourful language himself. Does that mean that Britain does still basically do whatever America tells it when it comes to foreign policy?
I don't think so, no. I mean, the fact is that American foreign policy at the moment is in hiatus. I mean, in Africa, for example, only 5 ambassadors have been appointed, and there's no assistant secretary for Africa. I think the tragedy is that Britain lacks a foreign policy too because of the coming to terms with Brexit. We've left ourselves in a position where, in a world where America is pursuing a course of abdication, where China is on the rise, Europe is the obvious pole for the liberal democratic world, and we're withdrawing from it. And so I think there really is a crisis, not just of diplomacy, but of the role of the West. Because the West was not just a geographical construct, it was also a political construct. And for all of the failings of Western foreign policy over the last 70 years, there's also been enormous strength that's been gained from upholding the values as well as the institutions of the post-Second World War settlement. And those values are not just about refugees, they're about human rights more generally. And if Western countries don't stick together to uphold those values, then I'm afraid the vacuum is created for the dictators and the bad actors to move in.
David Miliband, thank you very much for joining us. Well, Donald Trump's former campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, joins me now from New Hampshire. Corey Lewandowski, you'll have just heard, I hope, some of that very detailed argument that Donald Trump is making the world a more dangerous and unstable place by the use of this language. This isn't just throwaway comments that don't matter.
Look, I don't know if that's a question or that's a statement, but let me be very clear. The world is a safer place today because of President Donald Trump. And what we have seen is that this president has a relationship with China and with Russia to put pressure on North Korea so that they are not launching a nuclear weapon at their enemies. And the only way that that is going to take place is through the leadership of the United States working with our allies and the United Nations to put economic sanctions on North Korea, because right now Kim Jong-un is prepared, willing and able to deliver a nuclear weapon, because under 8 years of the Obama administration, he did nothing to stop the promulgation of nuclear weapons in North Korea. That is when the world was unsafe.
Let's come back to the language that Donald Trump is alleged to have used. I mean, the fact that he's denied it presumably shows that he knows that's wrong.
Well, he has said he didn't use the language, but let's talk about what the underlying issue is here. It's called immigration.
Yeah, but the language is important, as we've seen, because it's offended a huge number of nations. And people who were in the room with him have come out today and said, he said it. His denials are untrue. And these are distinguished public servants, elected people who've been in public service for a long time. So, you know,
well, look, I don't know what it's like to be in public service in Great Britain, but I can...
Sorry, go on.
Look, I don't know what it's like to be in public service in Great Britain, but in public service in the United States, I don't know if I'd call these individuals distinguished, okay? What we saw this week at the White House was an on-the-record, live discussion between members of the House and the Senate and the President, and it was a very engaging conversation. All of a sudden, the cameras go away, and the Democrats come out and say the President said something which others in the room have said that he did not say. Because the bottom line is, the Democratic Party in the country of the United States doesn't want to have immigration reform. They don't want to have a wall on the southern border. They don't want to stop chain migration. They don't want to get rid of the lottery system. They don't want to do any of those things because that's not good for their voters. And so what they want to do is they want to continue to allow illegal immigrants to pour across our borders, kill American citizens, and have their way at the voting booth with them. That is everything that this president is against and has pledged to stop.
So whatever language was used, it's clear that Donald Trump wants to reduce immigration from countries like Haiti, El Salvador, and much of Africa. You know, and he wants to go back to an immigration policy of, pre-1965, which was essentially racist. So is he racist, or does he just want, better off migrants to come to America who happen to be more often than not from predominantly white countries?
What the president wants is to be able to open our arms of this great country called the United States of America for the very best the world has to offer. And I believe, we're the greatest country in the world. And the highest honor we can bestow, the highest honor we can bestow upon somebody is to make them a citizen of our great country. And if you look at other countries around the world, like Australia and Canada, that have a merit-based immigration system that says if you are a nationally recognized individual or a world-renowned expert in something, we want you in our country. If you have an opportunity to contribute to the fabric of our society, not at a low-paying skilled job, but at a high-paying job, to bring those valedictorians of Harvard and Stanford and Brown and all the great schools in our country and let them stay. Those immigrants who come here and excel, they should be the opportunity.
So it's not black people
who are buying their way into the country through an EB-5 system, that's a scam.
So it's not black people that Donald Trump hates, it's just poor black people.
No, it has nothing to do with race. Why do you have to make it a race issue? It has nothing to do with
about race.
Look, he never said the word race. Look, if you want to make it a race issue, you can make it a race issue, or you can be honest with the people who are watching the show. It has nothing to do with race.
What do most people in Africa have in common?
The average income, the average income in Haiti is $800 a year. The average income in Norway is $97,000 a year. If you want to have people who are coming and migrating to your country who on average make $800 a year and have no tangible skills, then you're welcome to have them. What he said is, we want people who are going to come here and add to the fabric of our society and not cost the taxpayers and the first responders and the police and the fire and the EMS and the emergency service workers their jobs and have a strain on our economy. That's a very fair thing to do when you're the president of these United States.
Corey Lewandowski, thank you very much.
It is fair to say, perhaps, that abroad is not the place Donald Trump likes best. But even by his own outspoken standards, he's managed to alienate a pretty large chunk of it today. It wasn't just his abrupt decision to cancel a visit to London. We'll come to that in a moment. But it was a storm in a teacup compared to the massive international row he managed to generate with his remarks on immigration. He was reported to have described places like Africa and Haiti as, and I'm sorry to have to use the word, shitholes.
His provocative and divisive rhetoric is well known, but the political storm the president has now created is perhaps the most intense yet. A short time ago, and this is not without some irony, he signed a proclamation to honor the civil rights leader, Martin Luther King.
Mr. President, are you a racist?
He gave no response to the questions many in America are now openly asking.
Mr. President, will you respond to these serious questions about your statement, sir?
No, Mr. President, answer the line.
I'm talking to the President, not you,
talking
sir.
to you.
Mr. President, are you a racist?
But Trump's vulgar and derogatory description of Haiti, Central American and African countries is proving difficult to deny, for there were many witnesses, including some stunned senators.
In the course of his comments, said things which were hate-filled, vile, and racist. I use those words advisedly. I understand how powerful they are. But I cannot believe that in the history of the White House, in that Oval Office, any president has ever spoken the words that I personally heard our president speak yesterday. He said these hate-filled things, and he said them repeatedly.
That these comments were made in the revered setting of the Oval Office with all of its symbolism has shocked many. The United Nations giving this exceptionally blunt reaction.
These are shocking and shameful comments from the President of the United States. I'm sorry, but there's no other word one can use but racist. You cannot dismiss entire countries and continents as holes.
Haiti's ambassador spoke to me of the painful timing, the 8th anniversary of the country's great disaster.
As we're sitting here talking about this regrettable incident, Haitians today are mourning the life of 300,000 people who were lost during the earthquake. We're mourning the life of many folks, friends, family members, colleagues, and so forth.
To the president's critics, this is all part of a pattern that became increasingly clear on the campaign trail when he made these incendiary comments.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
In public, Donald Trump was speaking today of national unity.
No matter what the color of our skin or the place of our birth, we are all created equal by God.
But on the eve of this country's major civil rights holiday, the president's own racial views are under renewed scrutiny. Tonight, having just completed his first medical examination as president, Donald Trump is flying back to his resort hotel in Florida, leaving behind a nation yet again in the midst of a ferocious debate about his language and his conduct. Robert Moore, News at 10, Washington.
As well as the protest provoked by Donald Trump's remarks, it's inevitably raised questions about the facts and figures which lie behind what he said. Like, for instance, who exactly are the people that have been planning to get into President Trump's America? And how precisely does he want to change that? Our correspondent Dan Rivers has been investigating for us.
The president is clearly concerned about immigration and is reflecting genuine anger of his right-wing base. But what precisely is he worried about? Well, one issue is the so-called Dreamers, a nickname given to around 700,000 people who arrived in the US illegally as children. Now, under Obama, they were granted protection from deportation and given work permits. But Trump plans to end that in March unless he gets his way on things like the border wall. Then there's the visa lottery that allows lucky winners to move to the US. Last year, around 110,000 people were approved under this scheme, just under half from Africa. And finally, there's the temporary protected status that applies to citizens who can't return home due to conflict or natural disasters, like Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. It gives them the right to live and work in the US, but it's being phased out by Trump. And it was a proposed bipartisan deal on these policies, particularly in relation to Haitians and Africans, which seems to have caused Trump's outburst.
He's coming up to the one-year anniversary of his inauguration, and he wants to turn back to America, and especially to that 35 or 36% who have consistently supported him on the basis of a very nativist platform of anti-immigration, of strong borders, of tough on security, and say, we're sending these people home.
So what's the truth? Well, actually, most legal migrants to the US come from Mexico, China, India, the Philippines and Cuba. And what about Haiti? Well, according to the US census, of the 347 million people, fewer than 1 million describe themselves as Haitian, a quarter of 1%. Most of those live in Florida or New York, both places President Trump has a home. It's claimed President Trump suggested taking more Norwegians instead, yet America already has around 4.5 million people who said they were of Norwegian descent. In fact, there are more Norwegian heritage people in the US than sub-Saharan Africans and Haitians combined.
Dan Rivers reporting for us there. Well, let's move on now to that row over Donald Trump cancelling his visit here to London. He made no mention of being put off by possible protests, but instead claimed he objected to the new American embassy building he was meant to be opening. A bad deal done by Obama, he said. It was Bush, actually, but never mind. Boris Johnson responded with some colourful language of his own, as he blamed Sadiq Khan, or as he put it, that puffed-up, pompous popinjay in City Hall. Another quote of the day contender, perhaps, if you can work out what it actually means.
The Stars and Stripes rose solemnly by the new US Embassy in South London this morning, but the US President had already tweeted that he wasn't coming here to open it. Reason I cancelled my trip to London, he wrote, is that I am not a big fan of the Obama administration having sold perhaps the best located and finest embassy in London for peanuts, only to build a new one in an off location for $1.2 billion. Bad deal. Wanted me to cut ribbon. No. For some here, that's good news.
We can have, of course, a relationship with the United States, but that does not mean that we need to honour this person who promotes division, racism, misogyny, hatred, Islamophobia in its different forms.
London Mayor Sadiq Khan said it appears that President Trump got the message. His predecessor Boris Johnson hit back with, "We will not allow US-UK relations to be endangered by some puffed-up, pompous popinjay in City Hall." But are relations endangered?
You can't just brush it away and say it doesn't matter. But of course, below the surface of the relationship between Prime Minister and President, there is a fantastic amount that goes on, largely unchanged.
Yet, despite Mrs May's best efforts and the offer of a state visit, which still stands, Britain's looking a little isolated. President Trump has made 4 foreign trips, taking in more than a dozen territories. 3 have included European locations, including Germany, France, Italy and Belgium.
I think what is happening here, with the threat of mass protests coming from the Labour Party, damages Britain's relationship with America, damages Britain's ability post-Brexit to reach out to a wider world, is self-defeating. We're shooting ourselves in the foot.
Tonight, a US embassy spokesperson corrected the president, saying the new building actually cost less than $1 billion, funded through the sale of the old one. It wasn't his only mistake. Mr. Trump was wrong to blame the embassy move on the Obama administration. It started under the Bush presidency. And today, the Prime Minister's official spokesman took issue with the president's description of this as an off location, saying Vauxhall is a vibrant and important part of London. But the waxwork brought down here for a publicity stunt today remains as close as Donald Trump is coming to America's new embassy for the foreseeable future. Carl Dinnan, News at 10, South London.
Well, let's go back and join Robert Moore in Washington now. Robert, an awful lot inevitably to talk about tonight. I mean, first of all, do you think President Trump is ever going to come over to Britain? And as for these controversial remarks, I mean, I'm assuming it was a sort of pitch to his core support. Has it backfired for him, do you think?
Well, Tom, of course, it's possible that the president's going to make, at some point over the next 3 years, a working visit to the UK. I mean, after all, he is an Anglophile. And perhaps most importantly, post-Brexit, Britain is desperately in need of an ally and a friend in the White House. But I do sense on both sides of the Atlantic, although, yes, there is embarrassment tonight, there's also a great deal of relief. But, Tom, I cannot stress enough how this sort of bilateral controversy has been blown out of the water by the raging row here about those racially tinged comments the president made last night in the Oval Office. I mean, this news cycle is extraordinary. If you remember, it was a week ago after the publication of Fire and Fury, that book about the Trump White House, that America was debating whether the president was mentally stable. Now, that has long been forgotten, and the debate raging in this country is about whether he's a racist. I certainly get the sense his allies, his base, if you like, are staying loyal. But for his critics, this is a new low. Hillary Clinton tonight, for example, tweeting out that in her view, Trump is both ignorant and a racist. And characteristically from the president himself, no remorse and no apology.
You do wonder what will happen next, Robert. For now, thank you very much indeed.
Donald Trump, no stranger to outbursts and inappropriate and insulting language, has taken it to a new level and has been labelled today a racist by African politicians and diplomats after he was reported to have described some immigrants coming from Africa and Haiti as coming from shithole countries during a meeting at the Oval Office at which US senators were present. Trump denies using such derogatory language, but the African Union said it was alarmed by Trump's very racist comments. So just how damaging is this to a president who's shown himself unconcerned about making enemies? A few minutes ago, I spoke to our North America editor, John Sopel. To what extent is this furore of a different order to previous problems with Trump's language and his insults?
Well, I think, Kirsty, in a way, it's part of a piece, isn't it? I mean, Donald Trump has got in trouble with kind of comments that have a bearing on race before, whether it be the fact that Barack Obama was not an American, allegedly, something he withdrew in the later stages of the campaign, his comments on Charlottesville, the way he seemed to equate anti-racism protesters with the kind of far right, Ku Klux Klan, people carrying swastikas at a demonstration in Charlottesville, and now this. But I suspect what's different about this is that this has an international resonance. It is as though, if you accept the accounts of the meeting, and they haven't been strenuously denied by the White House, that Donald Trump believes there are the NATO countries, the ASEAN countries, and the shithole countries.
But that has huge implications, of course, for, as you say, international relations. The African Union have come out tonight. Various ambassadors from a number of the countries mentioned, and also, of course, the Haitian ambassador. To what extent does this do damage to relations, or is Trump aside from ordinary American politics as far as this goes?
Well, I think that, of course, it does damage in the sense of, you know, American leadership in the world. But Donald Trump hasn't particularly sought to have American leadership in the world, except when it suits him, except when he needs the support of others to rally around him. And I think that you saw it on the kind of vote where the condemnation of the announcement of moving the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. America found itself very, very isolated and angry at that isolation. And that is the price you pay with kind of making these unguarded remarks. And it does seem that it has damaged America, America's standing in the world. What about America's standing at home? I mean, among his supporters, I suspect if you ask people about what the president had said, you'd say, was it presidential? The pollster, I'm sure, would find they would say no. Were people surprised? I'm sure people would say no. And does it change your view of Donald Trump? Also, probably no, because this is what a lot of people voted for. A president who can say what they're thinking but dare not say.
John, thanks very much indeed. Now, two Trump stories make it both to The Guardian and the Daily Mail. The Guardian talks about the UN's verdict on Trump's remarks, though racist and shameful. And the Daily Mail takes a different tack, with Trump saying that he isn't coming next month to Britain after all, partly because he doesn't like the architecture of the new US embassy. He is going to miss out on the royal wedding. Well, we hoped to be joined by the African Union's ambassador to the US, but she's unfortunately been stuck in a snowstorm on the way to our studio, not here, but in Nashville. However, today, Donald Trump flew to the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Maryland for his first medical since taking office, from which he'll receive doctor's notes indicating whether he's fit to serve, which Trump is under no obligation to publish. But this is a physical, whereas the speculation surrounding his mental health is swelling constantly, especially after the publication of Michael Wolff's book. President Trump, of course, is self-diagnosed, calling himself mentally stable and like really smart. But such is one Ivy League psychiatrist's concern about Trump's mental state, which she describes as dangerous, that Bandy Lee held private meetings with members of Congress to convince them that he's unfit to serve and has been calling for a mental health evaluation for more than a year. I spoke to her earlier.
I've never met him, and I'm not interested in making any comments that relate to things that I cannot assess. So basically, the Goldwater rule was implemented after about 10% of the psychiatrists who were surveyed returned with an answer saying that Mr. Goldwater was unfit. That is not an assessment we can make from afar, and all that I am speaking to are the worrying signs of possible incapacity, and therefore calling for an evaluation.
But hang on, if you haven't met him, if you haven't spoken to him, if you haven't been in the same room as him, how can you assert that he is dangerous?
The information that's important for dangerousness is mostly not obtained in an in-person interview. In fact, a personal interview is not likely to reveal very important information. What you look at are the patterns of behavior, responses to situations, how the individual is evolving over time, and others' reports, people who are close to him, as well as written statements and verbal statements over time. So it's actually a vast amount of data that we already have on Mr. Trump, far more than we generally do with most of our patients, in fact. Still, that doesn't allow us to make a diagnosis, but there is certainly ample objective data to be able to say that he is at high risk of danger.
So tell me, in your evaluations and in your observation of the data and indeed your observation of the president, what do you think are the key things, the key signs which lead you to believe that this man is dangerous and capable of acting dangerously?
So first of all, past violence is the best predictor for future violence. He has shown verbal aggressiveness, a history of boasting about sexual assaults, a history of inciting violence at his rallies, a history of endorsing violence in his public speeches, and a continual taunting of a hostile nation with nuclear power. All of these are signs of danger, and he has also exhibited characteristics that are highly associated with violence, which include impulsivity, recklessness, paranoid reactions, showing a loose grip on reality, having low empathy, rage reactions, and a constant need to burnish a sense of power.
So that was Bandy Lee making her assessment of President Trump, and there has been reaction from African nations and indeed also from Haiti and from El Salvador and from the UN to remarks made by Donald Trump in the Oval Office in front of senators in a bipartisan meeting when apparently he talked about African countries and Haiti as being shithole countries. Now, we're delighted that the African Union's ambassador to the United States, Arukama Chimbori Kwao, has managed to make it through the snow in Nashville to join us this evening. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes to talk to you. And I wonder what the African Union's response has been to the office of the president. We know that you've said that he has been racist, but what is the next step to deal with this?
Well, as the African Union, we were quite appalled and infuriated, outraged by the comments. For a country like the United States, which is a valued partner for the Africans, this was quite a shock. So
President Trump appeared to say today that fewer immigrants from African nations, more immigrants from Norway. Do you think President Trump's statements have been racist?
Well, I think that his words will speak for themselves and for himself. But what I can say unequivocally is that our contributions to the United States as Africans who came electively and as Africans who came in shackles are undisputed. And for the administration to disregard the contributions of the Africans through the continental Africans as well as the African Americans, I think that is just really unfortunate.
Will the African Union be seeking an apology?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Now, Donald Trump has denied making derogatory remarks, though indeed the White House has not been, unequivocal in its denial. And I wonder if you'll be seeking clarification, and also, if it is indeed the case that he used that language, you'll be seeking an apology.
Oh, absolutely. We are going to be looking to having a conversation with the State Department and requesting for clarification on that matter. But also, I think it's important that there's a better understanding of the Africans by the administration, and that is my role, to make sure that our relationship with the United States is at par, and that whatever misunderstandings that exist within the administration, it is my responsibility to clarify. So I definitely will be reaching out to the State Department for continued conversation.
But it is interesting, isn't it? Because you have said and are saying that actually there is a vast misunderstanding of Africa within Trump's administration. Now, is that because there's been a change of administration, or do you think generally there is this lack of understanding?
I think it's an ongoing misunderstanding of Africa in general. And so we have a responsibility as Africans to also step up and speak out, make our positions known, make sure that not only must we expect the American agenda on Africa, we must also articulate our own agenda as Africans for the United States, make it very clear as to what we will accept from the United States, what areas are up for discussion as African nations. As African nations, absolutely. We must articulate our position, and we also have to be very clear as to what areas are completely no-go, what we will not accept at all. We have a responsibility to articulate our policy on the United States.
At the beginning of the program, our North America editor, John Sopo, said that, of course, there will be many, many people shocked by the language and the sentiment expressed by Donald Trump, though, as I say, he does deny it. But actually, for much of his base, they will think this is okay. They will expect this kind of language from the president. And that, in fact, John Sopo was saying that he is possibly saying what they find is unsayable by them, but they're quite happy to hear their president say it. What do you make of that?
Well, there's always going to be a segment of the population that feel otherwise. Even during slavery, as you will very well know, that there was a percentage of the population who feel that slavery should have continued. So to those, we pray for them. We are not going to stop moving the African agenda forward because of a small group of a few people who are in the fringes of society.
Well, thank you very much indeed for making the effort to join us, Ambassador.
Thank you so much for having me, and keep up the good work.